We thought it was just another charred scrap, a curiosity from a routine trench. Then a single line caught the conservator's eye, a claim that a man named Jesus had been seen, and not merely seen, but witnessed. The scroll calls itself a witness. The world might call it forbidden. I found it in the shadow of a collapsed atrium, beneath the root of an olive tree that had grown into the villa's ruined mosaic. Volterra is full of shards. The Etruscans left their mark, and the Romans left theirs. But this villa belonged to a collector of oddities. One layer of plaster over another, a hidden cabinet where things were taken out of sight. The papyrus had been burned at the edges, missing whole sentences, yet surprisingly legible where the heat had, paradoxically, preserved the ink. We dated the fiber, around 80 years after the common reckoning for the Crucifixion, a late 1st century hand, in Greek, a personal ledger of memory rather than an official report. I will be honest, when the team called me over, we joked about treasure hunters and forgers. We did not expect to open a file of confession, written in a voice that alternately holds itself like a soldier and trembles like a child. We did not expect the text to insist, from its first line, that it was the testimony of a Roman tribune, one who had stood in the mud of Jerusalem, who had seen what he would not unsee. Before I read the document aloud to the tentative circle of other specialists, I should say something that cannot be said too often. This scroll is a single, subjective account. It is a found document. It carries the bias of memory, the pride of rank, and the terror of one man's imagination or miracle. It is presented here as a recovered narrative, not as proof. Take what follows as the voice recorded on that fragile strip of papyrus, a voice from a man who calls himself by his family name and by his office, a man who insists he watched. If this kind of discovery intrigues you, if you like history's dark corners and the questions that won't leave you, stay with me. There is one document, one voice, and a warning folded into the last line. He begins by naming himself, in the plain cadence of record-keeping, a tribune born to a family whose reputation had opened doors and closed some just as harshly. He writes of ambition, how a scion of status learns the craft of command, how a young officer learns to count men, to read the faces of the crowd, and how pride gets tucked into the lining of armor. He had served in Syria. He had learned language and law and the fine, cruel arithmetic of discipline. He was, he says, the sort of man who believed the world to be a ledger, debts paid, orders obeyed. He was sent to Judea in the midst of a fevered spring. Pilate had called for troops because Passover brought crowds, and with crowds came noise, slogans, and unpredictability. He mentions Jerusalem like a place of ancient bones and new tinder, markets that smelled of lamb and sweat, priests moving through their duties, people who pressed towards the temple like water finding its own rim. He recounts, with the exactness of someone who remembers the placement of his standards, the day a man came into the city as if he had stepped out of a story. He writes that the man rode a donkey. That part is ordinary enough, familiar in the way a procession might enter the city on a day of expectation. But the tribune's eye finds an abnormality in the ordinary. He insists again and again that what stood there was not merely a poor preacher or a charismatic puzzler. He uses words that try to marry what he knows of flesh and what he cannot fit under those categories. He saw pallor like paper stretched over bone, not the color of human illness, but of something drawn out, inked by some hand he could not name. The mouth, there his words achieve the first of many shudders, was wrong. He writes simply, with the soldier's economy, the man had no mouth. Not disfigured, not covered, but absent, as if speech had been unstitched from his face. The crowd shouted, and a voice seemed to come from him, yet the tribune claims no lips moved and no throat strained. He records the paradox plainly and with a growing agitation that climbs the lines of the scroll. How did sound issue from nothing? And then the small, terrible detail that hooks the next 100 pages. Eyes. Not simply a human's pair, but a scatter, like beads sewn into skin. Tiny sockets dotted the forehead and the hairline, pooled under the brow like a constellation. Some were set along the brim of his hat. Others lay not in neat symmetry, but as if someone had sampled the concept of sight and spread it lavishly across the face that he recognized as a face. Each eye, the Tribune insists, was watchful in a way that made him feel seen through a dozen prisms at once. When those eyes turned toward him, the Tribune writes it as a physical event, he felt a coldness in the ribs, as if his bones were being numbered. He was trained to hold his posture. He was trained to translate fear into distance. At first, he assumes the sensation belongs to the fever of the crowd, to the exaggerations that come with rumor. He writes that others saw a man riding a donkey. Some called him prophet. Others shouted for spectacle. The priests whispered. He details the exchange with Pilate in administrative terms. Questions were asked, sentences were measured, and yet there is a note of something like incredulity in the Tribune's hand. There is a belief, buried beneath protocol, that perception is private. No one backed his report because the eyes had not been a blemish to others. No one but him, it seemed, had watched teeth of light where a mouth should be. The trial is captured in a few jagged strokes. The scroll's author recounts standing near the praetorium, the city's stones sloping with the weight of a crowd. He says Pilate treated the matter like a nuisance, a man to be processed, a law to be kept. He says the Jewish leaders were loud and precise about charges of sedition, and that he watched the way men in robes formed ranks of accusation. Yet through those formalities, the Tribune keeps returning to the same obsessions: the eyes, the absence of a mouth, the unmisplacing of voice. When the man is condemned and the nails are readied, the Tribune writes of a voice that was not entirely outside of him. He does not say he heard it the way ears hear. He uses another verb, an internal verb, like the beginning of a spell or the pressing of a thumb on a wound. While the hammer rose, while the iron found his wrist, something said to him in a tone that was neither human nor animal, but like a claim. You will watch until the counting stops. He writes that the phrase did not so much mean ages as it meant motionless attendance, an unsettable responsibility. He was asked, in that instant, to be a ledger that could not be closed. The crucifixion is depicted with short, dislocated sentences. The Tribune is economical here. Where earlier he luxuriates in grotesque detail, at the nailing he becomes practical and, beneath the practicality, terrified. He records the red of blood and the smell of iron, but those images are secondary to what he keeps seeing: the body's human form, pinned and falling into the geometry of wood, versus the thing beneath, a form he insists had a different kind of endurance. Once the human frame faltered, once breathing thinned, and a corpse seemed to take on its natural stillness, the Tribune writes something else remained intact. Where flesh cracked, whatever the man truly was did not cleave. It went on. There is an economy to his fear that makes his confessions all the more potent. He does not invent drama. He keeps to orders, counting the men, naming the positions, noting who guarded which flank, but every catalogued detail leads the reader toward the same repeating truth. He had seen a separation, a human shell that could be pierced, and a core that refused to be stopped. When the tomb is prepared, the Tribune is assigned among others to watch. He records the shift from crowd to small numbers. It is as if his world narrows from an uproar to the precise metallic clockwork of a sentinel's night. 3 days, as any guard knows, for weather to change, for rumor to grow teeth. The orchard around the garden is a place of roots and hollows. He writes the names of neighboring landmarks like mnemonic devices, as if saying them aloud might anchor him to the ground. Those nights, the words on the papyrus tremble. He tells of sleep that does not come, of eyes that close but see on. Images pressed into a theater behind eyelids. On the third night, an event that could be described clinically as the opening of a tomb turns into a scene worthy of myth. He writes that the air did not shift so much as the world altered its expectation. That sentence appears with the simple horror of a fact found in a quiet drawer. I no longer age. He speculates, sometimes with sober conjecture, sometimes with the tremor of superstition, that whatever he witnessed at the tomb had made him a fixture, a witness whose life is held open like a hinge to prove something to the ages. This claim of arrested aging is central to why the scroll becomes a danger in the voice of its author. Imagine a man forced to watch a story's every stage, yet never allowed to die from the scene. Imagine memory piled on memory like weights. He writes that he tried to speak, to warn, to pull the authorities' attention toward the anomalies he had seen. He sent letters, he told men of rank, and often he was met with medical explanations, with suspicion of arrogance. Over time, the document suggests the men who did not age became stories, rumors of a madman who claimed to see other forms. Where he wanted to be believed, he was marginalized. Where he sought to act, he found obstacles of human nature, fear, embarrassment, the efficient turning of the world away from uncomfortable oddity. The scroll complicates the reader's sympathies with another careful move. It does not demonize the followers. The Tribune writes of a woman who fed the poor in a way that made him ashamed. He writes of a man who, in the rubble of a house, repeated a verse so tender that it made a child unclench. He confesses, with a weight that later lines of the text return to with almost religious sorrow, that he himself could not always resist the warmth of simple kindness. The Tribune treats the followers as humane actors. His problem, and the reason he feels the need to leave such a record, is less that their deeds are without compassion, and more that their origin, as seen by him, is suspect. He traces the movement's spread as if counting the chapters of a book. In some places, the teaching softens tyrants. In others, it incites riots. He notes that the story of the man who died on a cross became a parable retold in markets and private rooms in the same voice that had pressed the blade into his hand and found it hollow. He watches the network as an infection, a metaphor born from his military training. And yet he sometimes pauses, his language softening, to describe a hand that had healed a fevered child. He is at once a strategist and a man broken by contradiction. His certainty about a conspiracy shifts in tone from the meticulousness of a planner to the tremulous pleading of someone who fears a fate he cannot fix. He writes that he is bound to watch, that he has walked beneath the movement's banner when it passed his own city and felt its children singing. He tells a story of confronting a small gathering that called out for him by name, a gathering that had orated where he had once served. He says they petitioned him, not with anger, but with a softness that disarmed him. They touched his arm and called him brother. He writes that for a moment, the line between his suspicion and human tenderness blurred, and for a moment he felt like nothing but a man who wanted to belong. Then he remembers the eyes, the peculiar scattering of sight, and the memory retook him like a hand. The scroll's tone becomes more fevered as it nears its end. The handwriting quickens, the ink presses deeper into fiber. He lists places, names of minor figures, the routes the followers took through the empire. He becomes obsessive about the need for containment. He proposes strategies, which alternate between the plausible and the pathological. Find the source, cut off the centers of gathering, arrest the emissaries who travel with songs. He confesses he tried to bring men to the praetorians, to governors, to the magistrates of towns. He was met with bureaucracy, with the reasonable questions of men who needed proof measured in the weights of law. His proof, he writes, was always personal, and therefore always suspect. What makes the account a danger, why it might be called forbidden in some contexts, are the last pleas. The Tribune claims that he wrote this record, that he hid it, that he placed it where travelers might later find it if the world were attentive and brave. He writes that he is tired of being the only person who remembers with such clarity. He asks the reader, whoever finds the scroll in centuries to come, to look for him. He tells of secret signs, a name, an emblem, the place he might be living under a lesser name. He writes it as if the ledger compels him. He must keep this open. He must ask another to act on the impulse he no longer can trust alone. When the text stops, it stops like a conversation broken mid-breath. The final line is a plea woven with menace and mercy. "Find me," he writes. "Stop them, or find me before they find you." The sentence leaves no comfortable closure. I closed the book and felt, for the first time since I had handled ancient threads of parchment, a cold that had nothing to do with winter. The team argued for days about the ethics of publication. A document like that is a spark in tinder. Scholars salivate at new evidence. Priests bristle at reinterpretation. And governments fear instability born of rumor. We did not hide the find because of state pressure. We hesitated because it is dangerous to put a single man's terror in the hands of millions who might demand certainty. What struck me most, as a modern officer of science rather than of Rome, was the tone of the scroll. The tribune is not a caricature of paranoia. He is educated, painstaking, painfully attentive to the rules of evidence he was taught in the legions. List your witnesses, note your dates, record names. When he does these things, it is to the best of his ability, and yet, like any human being, he filters all through the lens of a life that cannot be undone. He is clear that his account might be read as mania. He anticipates that critique and burns in the margins his own rationalizations. He lists names, he mentions methods of counting, he repeats the atmospheric anomalies in ways that try to make them measurable. There is another way to read the scroll, of course. Perhaps he hallucinated. Perhaps he had a neurological condition, an infection or a trauma, that made faces bloom into eyes or eroded his perception of mouths. Perhaps the voice was a feverish creation. The scroll provides no medical record. It gives only the grammar of memory. It is a man who keeps sight and cannot let go. Perhaps, too, there is a metaphysical reading. Some movements take as their seed things that appear monstrous to an outsider. Some miracles read like assaults to the pragmatic man. The scroll gives us one human reaction to something that became for many a source of hope. That is its power and its peril. As the archaeologist who first laid hands on it, I felt a duty to present the translation with caution. The team made an editorial choice. We would publish a diplomatic text, a careful reproduction with annotations about context, about the uncertain phrases, and with disclaimers stating that this is a single, subjective testimony. We added footnotes where practices of the time might explain certain rituals, and where gaps in the papyrus left entire lines to conjecture. We did not invent missing content. We did not fill blanks with sermons or with modern outrage. We framed the scroll explicitly as a found document, a narrative that reflects the perceptions and possible biases of its author. That is an important safeguard, because the scroll's language left unframed can be read in destructive ways. A narrative that equates the sacred with the uncanny can be weaponized into a polemic against belief. We took pains to preserve the human dignity of those the writer judged, because even a hostile witness cannot be allowed to erase the grief of a mother or the sincerity of a disciple. The scroll, for all its terror, contains the softest sketches of human tender acts that the tribune watched in passing and did not understand. He could not reconcile the two, and that contradiction is the heart of the document. After we decided to make a translation available, we had another argument: what to withhold. The scroll names a town in the margins where the tribune claims to have seen a sign. The text hints that those who find the man will find themselves marked. Do we publish that line? Would that be an incitement? In the end, we published everything, with the one repeated caveat: this is a single account. Readers should not take it as a correction to canonical writings, nor as a definitive revelation. It is a voice among many. There are questions, though, that even our most cautious framing cannot repress. Suppose the man truly believed what he wrote. Suppose there was an event he experienced that disciplined his life into an eternal witness. What do we do with the idea of a man who would watch forever? He writes that he wished for death as a release and yet felt a need to keep telling. He calls the reader to act as an agent of secrecy, to find him, to end the pattern, or to bear witness with him. The text is less a neat accusation than it is a siren calling someone to decide. Reading the scroll, I was struck by how much his fear is like ours. He believes in containment. He believes in stopping contagious ideas when they begin crawling through homes. Maybe he was right in some ways. Maybe he was wrong. We cannot know. But his insistence that one man's vision might seed a movement is a powerful reminder that history is not only the record of events, but of perception. The stories that move a culture are often filtered through people whose sight is imperfect, whose motives are mixed. I have tried here to present the document with fidelity to the voice, to the cadence of a man who wrote as if speaking into a ledger. What follows are selected and translated excerpts from that manuscript, arranged to preserve the narrative arc the author intended. They are not interjections of our commentary. They are reproductions of what he wrote, with the minimal footnoting required for clarity. I was born to a family that expected men to answer with deeds. My name is not a prayer, it is an account. I learned to count ropes and men, and I learned to keep silence where silence was demanded. I went to Jerusalem because duty called. Pilate wanted soldiers for Passover. The city was swollen with fevered bodies and with a smell of lamb and oil. The man came on a donkey, and at first I thought nothing. Processions enter the city every festival. But his face was like torn paper. He had no mouth. There were small eyes, more than two, festooned along his brow and where a mouth should be. When his eyes, the extra ones, turned at me, I felt something like enumeration inside my ribs. I had seen plagues and portents, but this sight lodged like a splinter. I tried to tell myself I had imagined. I could not dislodge the fact of it. They led him before Pilate. The governor asked questions, and men in the temple answered with a practiced cadence. I stood in uniform and watched. When they took the man's arm to pull him to the cross, and the hammer rose to drive iron, there came to me a voice not from the air, but from the hollow between my teeth. It pressed a sentence into me as if to sign a ledger. You will hold this witness. You will see beyond your days. The hammer fell. When the body hung and the crowd's noise softened to a dull animal sound, the human part of him slackened as bodies do. Yet something within him did not. Under the stillness there was a solidity that would not break. My spear could have split bone, and yet the thing that I now name did not yield to such measures. I have seen a man die and something else keep moving. I was placed at the tomb. 3 nights I kept watch. The air itself seemed to hush on the final night. A red veil pulled over the sky. The stone was rolled away. A form stepped out, and behind it more and more forms, crowded like mirrors that would not match. I struck. The blade went through what looked like flesh and met only the resistance of suggestion. Their many eyes turned on me as if to count me, and the empty voice found my thought. We will meet again. I could not bind them, and I could not forget. The years passed around me like seasons. Men died and left graves. I remained. I write not to brag of this, but to record my burden. I do not age as men do. I have watched movements spread like ink across water. I have seen the words they teach, love, forgiveness, union, translate into acts that sometimes made me weep and sometimes made me ready my spear. I could not find a law to bring them to court. The law arrests acts, not belief. So I wrote this to leave a ledger for any who might find it. Find me if you must. Interrupt them if you can. I do not know who to trust. I know only what I have been given to remember. There are lines in the manuscript where the tribune's anger becomes personal. The way he recalls being mocked. The way he watched a child healed by hands he mistrusted. There are also ellipses where the papyrus is missing, as if the manuscript itself kept its secrets. Those gaps are as important as the lines we can read, because they remind us of the partiality of memory and the possible misreadings that erupt when we attempt to stitch the past whole. We have choices now as a community of scholars and as individuals. We could thrust this text into the blazing public square without context, letting it be used as a cudgel or a curiosity. We could lock it away, deeming it too dangerous for general consumption. Or we could treat it as a recovered voice, something to be studied in the company of other testimonies, with the humility to say, one person reported one set of experiences. If you are inclined towards sensationalism, the scroll offers spectacle. If you are inclined towards spiritual tenderness, the scroll offers a troubled soul who loved and feared and erred. If you are inclined toward historical inquiry, the scroll is a problematic, enthralling data point, a subjective account that must be situated within archaeology, philology, and an awareness of how memory falters. I leave you with what the scroll leaves most loudly, the question it poses rather than the conclusion it demands. The man who wrote it knew he would be dismissed by many. He also seemed certain that silence would unmoor us in ways he found terrifying. He wanted someone else to shoulder the possibility that what he had seen might be true, or to prove him wrong. He chose to hide his plea where time might find it, and to mark his words with the blunt honesty of a man who had stood near a crucifix and seen the world rearrange itself.
As for me, after translating and conserving the piece, I took a final photograph and held the preserved strip as a thing both fragile and implacable. Its fibers seemed, in my hands, to carry an urgency that reached far beyond their thickness. That is the real danger of manuscripts like this. They do not kill with swords. They infect curiosity. They demand decisions. They force us to ask what we would do if an authoritative voice, one with the ring of uniform and duty, stood before us and said that the very thing we hold dear might wear a different face. So I ask you to consider it as it was presented to me, a found, single testimony. Consider the bias of an observer, the possibility of neurological and social explanations, and the honest human motives that might cause someone to fear a peaceful movement precisely because it amasses power. Remember the tenderness the tribune could not accept, and the fractures in his own life caused by the inability to strike a balance between suspicion and mercy. I will end with the same open line that made the discovery inescapable. The scroll ends with a plea and a threat. Find me, it says. Stop them, it demands. Or, find me before they find you. I cannot tell you whether the plea is a salvation or an attempt to bind a reader to a conspiracy he never intended to join. I can only say that the manuscript exists, that it speaks in a voice both authoritative and broken, and that it insists, above all, upon the weight of a single witness. Decide what you will do with that weight. Read the translation in full, if you choose, and weigh the tribune's testimony against other accounts, against archaeological context and the wide, knotty web of human belief. Ask whether a man who watched forever should be trusted to interpret what he saw. Ask whether our own eyes, when confronted with the inexplicable, do more to reveal truth or to shape it. If you want to see the full annotated translation, it's linked in the description below. If you want more examinations like this, careful, cautious, and aimed at the heart of historical difficulty, there are other videos where we unpack documents, analyze context, and resist the temptation to claim certainty where none exists. Above all, walk away with the scroll as what it is, a voice from the past,
insistent and imperfect, asking the living to decide how to carry its memory. What would you believe? The canonical witnesses, countless voices woven in time? The single incendiary testimony of one man who refused to die? Or something else altogether? The choice, as always, is yours.